When there's a discussion on deep fake, we end up saying that it's very hard these days. It's hard to believe what we see, what we hear, what we read, or we have to be skeptical about what we see, what we hear, what we read. And those challenges can be traced right back to data quality issues.
Absolutely. And the chaos that ensues, right, in what you've described, the inconsistency of data, the lack of data awareness. I mean, those are big problems that really undermine the overall security around their data. But I think most importantly, there's the concept of trust, right? So it really undermines the trust that you have in the people that you deliver a service to, your customers, your employees, right? I think that innovation without trust is a liability. We did a study, we surveyed, I think it was 1,900 CIOs, and 73% of them felt that they needed to reduce complexity. The average CIO we talked to had over 15 separate cybersecurity applications running. Could you imagine 15 different dashboards, 15 different interpretations of risk? The fragmentation alone of that is pretty significant, but it creates these blind spots, right? So as you start to look at how you adopt new technologies with those blind spots, it makes things even more difficult. So it becomes not a data management issue, but it becomes a risk issue, right? If you don't understand your data, you don't understand where your risk is. How do you really proceed confidently? How do you get approval from the board to kind of take on these initiatives?
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast Series with Dr. Dave Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is the author of the book Cybersecurity Readiness, a holistic and high-performance approach, a Sage publication. He has been studying cybersecurity for over a decade, authored and edited scholarly papers, delivered talks, conducted webinars and workshops, consulted with companies, and served on a cybersecurity SWAT team with Chief Information Security Officers. His work on proactive cybersecurity has been featured on USA Today. Dr. Chatterjee has been a tenured professor at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. As a Duke University visiting scholar, Dr. Chatterjee teaches in the cybersecurity programs at the Pratt School of Engineering.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast Series. I'm your host, Dave Chatterjee. Today's conversation focuses on a crucial but often overlooked factor in artificial intelligence success: information readiness. AI systems are only as intelligent as the information they consume. And without trusted, governed, and contextualized data, even the most sophisticated AI can fail dramatically. As I make this introduction, it brings to mind the very often used phrase in the early days of computing. And that phrase was garbage in, garbage out. And it still persists even today in the days of AI. In fact, it is of even greater significance given how data intensive everything has become. But anyhow, we will be discussing a lot of interesting stuff. And to help me with the discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Greg Clark, who's the Senior Director of Product Management and Strategy at OpenText. He has over 2 decades of experience leading innovations at CA, HP, Micro Focus, and now OpenText. His expertise ranges from data security, compliance, and AI-driven cyber resilience. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you, my friend.
Dave, it is a pleasure. Thank you very much. An exciting topic for sure. And I think at times it may be overshadowed by other things, right? But I think information readiness is something that, whether it's the missing puzzle piece, but it certainly is a tool that a lot of organizations can use to accelerate AI, do it securely, do it safely. So really happy to be here and engage with your audience on this topic.
You're exactly right. It's almost like we are coming back to basics. When we discussed this topic, I was reflecting on it And a question that kept coming to my mind is, so what's new? So what's interesting? But as I pondered more and I reflected more, did my research, I came to the realization that, yeah, we have the algorithms, sophisticated algorithms, we have great computing power. However, if the data quality is not good, if the governance that manages transparency, that manages access control and other aspects to ensure that only quality data is being used for processing and drawing inferences. How do you make sure of that? We tend to get enamored by technology, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Data
Right.
has to be our focus, and all that centers around data. But we will talk more about that. Before we delve deeper, how about you share with my listeners some professional highlights?
Well, you said 2 decades. Wow, Dave, that makes, well, the gray in my beard, does show that I've been in this industry for 20 years. I started out in, 20, 21 years ago
Hmm.
in enterprise content management. So,
Uh-huh.
what's really interesting in the 20 plus years that I've worked in software, other than 9 months at a startup, I have worked for OpenText or a company that OpenText has bought. So this is my third, this is my third time around at OpenText. But yes, I started my career in enterprise content management. So really helping organizations, manage their most critical assets, retention, disposition, the crown jewels. Pivoted to e-discovery and regulatory compliance. So really dealing with a lot more of the regulatory side of things, right? So federal rules of civil procedure, being able to find responsive data sets and respond. I shifted back at that point to back into enterprise content management. Again, as things started to evolve in the market, we started dealing with more than 5 or 10% of data, which were official records, and information governance started to take hold. And what information governance really is about is there's data that runs your business, right? And you need to be able to, wrap your arms around that and manage that. Not everything's a record, but it's what drives business on a day-to-day basis. So I started back in enterprise content management, about 7 or 8 years ago. And then what we did at Micro Focus is we started to bring together parts of our business that really represented this new landscape that was emerging, which is enterprise cybersecurity. So application security, security operations, data security, identity and access management. So my business, the ECM business, was merged in with our data protection business. We created this data security portfolio, which provided data discovery and really understanding risk sensitive data from a privacy angle, from a sensitivity angle, and the capabilities to protect that information. So that's really been my journey over the last 20 years. I keep on trying to get out of enterprise content management. They keep on pulling me back in. But since for the last 7, 8 years, it's been around data security. And then my new role is kind of more across all of those pillars in cybersecurity. So yeah, it's been quite a journey, but it's been an interesting one for sure.
Fabulous, fabulous. So you are the content guru or the information guru. You're
I've seen a lot. I have seen a lot. Yes, absolutely.
fascinating. And we will draw from that expertise as we go down this path. So, backing up a little bit, for the sake of listeners, since our discussion is around information readiness and why that is critical for the success of AI systems, it's important to define what we mean by information readiness. One way of thinking about it is the state of being able to supply AI systems with clean, contextual, secure, and ethically governed data. So there are lots of dimensions to information readiness. For instance, we are talking about the integrity and quality of the data. We are talking about lineage and traceability. We're talking about security and privacy, context and relevance, And last but not the least, timeliness and accessibility. Greg, I'll turn it back to you. Your thoughts?
Well, in the overlay of AI, that problem has existed even before AI was emerging technology that companies were looking to build, right? So when we go back in my history, right, the ability to understand data, to keep only what you have a business purpose for, to ensure that you understand where your high value data is, where your low value data is, and be able to make some real conscious decisions in terms of making a smaller haystack to manage. It really comes down to understanding data, right? The better organizations understand their information, the more ready they are to comply with regulators, to meet privacy obligations, to meet emerging technologies like agentic AI and GenAI head on. The better organizations have their house in order in terms of data hygiene, in terms of understanding where the crown jewels are and why they have that information, puts them in a much better posture to adopt tools and technologies like AI, but in a more reasonable, responsible, ethical, contextual way, like you were describing. The better understanding you have of your data, the more comfortable you are in terms of adopting in this time of exceptional change around AI.
True, true. When I reflect on the challenges or the pitfalls of not being ready from a data quality, information quality standpoint, I can think of scenarios where you come across dirty or fragmented data across silos. You come across lack of metadata standards. I've also seen instances of very poor governance of unstructured data, weak security and privacy controls, and last but not the least, absence of contextual grounding, leading to AI outputs that might be technically correct, but it doesn't seem very relevant. So, as I said at the very beginning, garbage in, garbage out. If we want the AI systems to deliver valuable insight, we have to make sure that the infrastructure, the ecosystem that supports those systems, they are robust, they are secure, and they are only allowing the ingesting of quality input, proper processing of that input, so that the output and the inferences that are drawn from the output make sense. Yesterday, I was recording another episode, and we were discussing the deep fake phenomenon. And invariably, when there's a discussion on deep fake, we end up saying that it's very hard these days. It's hard to believe what we see, what we hear, what we read, or we have to be skeptical about what we see, what we hear, what we read. And those challenges can be traced right back to data quality issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the chaos that ensues, right, in what you've described, the inconsistency of data, the lack of data awareness, I mean, those are big problems that really undermine the overall security around their data. But I think most importantly, there's the concept of trust, right? So it really undermines the trust that you have in the people that you deliver a service to, your customers, your employees, right? I think that where innovation without trust is a liability. We did a study with the Ponemon Institute where we surveyed, I think it was 1,900 CIOs, and 73% of them felt that they needed to reduce complexity. The average CIO we talked to had over 15 separate cybersecurity applications running. Could you imagine 15 different dashboards, 15 different interpretations of risk? The fragmentation alone of that is pretty significant, but it creates these blind spots, right? So as you start to look at how you adopt new technologies with those blind spots, it makes things even more difficult. So, it becomes not a data management issue, but it becomes a risk issue, right? You just can't, going back to what I said earlier, if you don't understand your data, you don't understand where your risk is, how do you really proceed confidently? How do you get approval from the board
Absolutely.
to kind of take on these initiatives?
Yeah, you can't overemphasize or emphasize enough this importance of trust. At the end of the day, unless we can trust the AI systems that are in place, that we can trust the output of the AI systems, the inferences that are being drawn from that output, it's pointless, it's meaningless. Talking about liability, it brings to mind Air Canada case. This was a liability case, which the time period I think was 2024, when Air Canada's customer service chatbot misinformed passengers about refund policies. And guess what? The court ruled the airline to be legally liable. It doesn't still surprise me because I always felt that you can't blame the technology or blame the chatbot. And when I say you, I mean the organization. The organization has to take responsibility. But it's definitely a clear message coming from the court systems that you better do your part so that your systems are functioning the way they need to function. And if they don't, then you will be held responsible.
Absolutely. And I remember that case, very well. It was a bereavement policy. So the gentleman that was, on the Air Canada website was doing some research, how do I apply for this bereavement fare?
Yeah.
And accuracy, right, is a huge thing, right? So the chatbot is trying to do a good job. It's trying to deliver the best service it can to an Air Canada customer. So it didn't find a policy. So it made one up because it was trying to deliver, the best customer service it possibly could. And it's really interesting because the way that these sort of neural networks work is that if you and I were to read 1,000 documents, we could maybe make some inferences, some connections. But the things that AI is capable of doing across these data sets, the things that it can remember, like a credit card number, and with the right prompts, that information can easily be exposed. So, having the right data management and readiness processes is important, but also ensuring that you have auditability, explainability about how all these systems use data, what data is being used by AI, how is it curated, right? What information is contained within there, because if it's not an internal audit, it's the regulators or your legal team that will come asking. And you need to be in a position to explain. And like you said, there's evidence showing that the courts are leaning towards, hey, you need to have your house in order to deploy these technologies. And you're responsible for how they respond.
Very true, very true. So, as you're probably aware, I developed a framework for cybersecurity governance. It's a holistic framework. It has three anchors or three dimensions: commitment, preparedness, and discipline. And I apply those dimensions to help organizations understand where their strengths are, where the vulnerabilities are. Then they are able to do some self assessments and come up with a cybersecurity readiness score. And then we go from there. So the reason I'm mentioning that is if I were to apply the same lens to the topic that we are discussing today, which is the significance of information readiness. Information readiness being that link, that critical link to AI success. If I were to apply those three dimensions of my cybersecurity governance framework, then I see commitment in the form of leadership, prioritizing data ethics, transparency, governance as strategic enablers of AI success. From a preparedness standpoint, as you said extremely well, organizations must invest in infrastructure, in metadata management, data integration, validation pipelines. So there are so many things organizations have to consciously do. And last but not the least, how do you sustain it? How do you institutionalize it, that it becomes part of your system? That's where discipline comes into play. And in the context of information readiness, we are talking about ongoing audits. We're talking about model validation. We're talking about providing some oversight over information quality. on a periodic basis. So this is a continuous process that organizations need to engage in. And they have to come at it from a strategic level, from a procedural level, and from a technological level. It's a multi-pronged approach. When you are engaging with organizations in this context, what do you see to be the biggest challenge or the biggest hurdle? Or maybe the biggest misconception?
Well, I think that, most organizations just can't measure success and they don't operationalize what you just described.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, when you talk about this as a continual process, in a lot of cases, the maturity level of customers is highly dependent on a myriad of things. But we do a lot of project work, right? And I think that's where the maturity of most organizations are at. The project work is, I need to wrangle my data. I need to understand from a data hygiene perspective, kind of create that smaller haystack like I described. The more mature organizations are ones that are operationalizing what you described. So they've got board level buy-in.
Yeah.
They have the right budgets assigned to this as a practice. Some are even hiring chief AI officers as a new role, but they are delivering metrics and ROI in a way that the board can understand.
Yeah.
It's not about the number of CVEs closed. It's about how much of my financial risk exposure did we shrink? How much did we reduce our time to respond? Right. And I think that, what pipelines have we put in place to test our AI applications before those things go out into the real world? And then from a discipline perspective, really putting practices in place that we're going to curate data for these systems and we're going to protect that data before it goes into the pipeline, right? We're going to tokenize data. We're going to ensure that, data is encrypted. We're going to start looking at ways in which we can implement policy as code to, when they see a PCI information that will mask that data automatically. But really, at the end of the day, it's how do we embed governance as a discipline inside of the business? And it needs that board level, approval and budgets.
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, another example that comes to mind about institutionalizing governance is JP Morgan, where they have in place what is called the Responsible AI Council, which mandates risk, compliance, and data quality reviews before any model deployment. So here we have essentially an oversight committee, which is assessing risk, ensuring compliance, making sure that there is a check on data quality before a model is released for regular usage. And what's the way they are looking at success? That success comes from integrating governance into decision making, ensuring that every AI output is grounded in validated, secure, and contextually accurate data. But to make this happen, it has to be an organization-wide effort. However, in this particular case, it has to be driven from the top. There has to be a governance structure, which is like the Responsible AI Council that they have in place. And that committee would mobilize organization-wide support, mobilize organization-wide awareness, and to your point, establish some metrics which are meaningful from the standpoint of strategic value creation. Because if we get to the weeds and keep talking about the technical metrics, like you used number of CVEs that were reduced or that were removed, that doesn't cut it. You have to ultimately show the relationship or show the connection, direct or indirect, with the top line and the bottom line.
And that plays into trust as well, Dave, right?
Yep.
Again, there's trust at the board level, but those metrics are also can build and establish trust as that's a competitive advantage, right?
Precisely.
The more secure your business is, the more secure your AI is, right?
Precisely.
The more secure your business is. Right? It's not just about how secure your systems are, right? It's how secure is the business as a whole.
Precisely means you've just taken the words out of my mouth. I've been preaching this over and over again. In fact, I have a presentation which is titled Cybersecurity as a Strategic Capability. I'd like to get the leadership mindset to shift in the direction of how can we develop and sustain security capabilities that will give us competitive edge. You said it even better. That's the way to look at it, not at a micro level. Okay, how do we achieve compliance? Are we meeting all these requirements? Those are important, but they all ultimately add up. And the big picture is, does it make the entire organization and its ecosystem relatively more secure than their competitors, whereby a customer is more likely to trust and invest in those companies, whether they're buying products, whether they're investing in securities. So securing your data, securing your system, securing your networks, it is not just a technical initiative. It is a strategic initiative in today's day and age.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
But sometimes it gets lost in the rush to deliver, in the pell-mell rush to make things happen. These cybersecurity tends to get overlooked unless the organization gets hit by an attack, gets hit by a lawsuit, then they take a step back and reevaluate. But I've always said that let's be proactive about it. Let's assume the worst can happen. Let's create different scenarios of risk and implications, and let's try to mitigate those risks before we find ourselves or if we find the organization in it. That'll be nice if organizations were to operate that way, but I would say that not many have bought into it yet.
It starts in different organizations in different areas, right? But rarely do you see a single organization that has a very strong understanding of their data, has implemented zero trust and least privilege, starts to implement practices around human, non-human, and agentic identities and how those will interact and how those translate into signals in the SOC, and how do you start to determine there's all of these pockets are happening, right? But back to operationalizing things, right? I think that in a perfect world, businesses need a place to start. And I think it really comes down to what the priorities are in the C-suite, what the priorities are at the CISO level, and where their biggest pain might reside, right? And we're starting to see, especially with a lot of the challenges we've had with AI failures and failure to launch and challenges with data quality and the things that we've been talking about, is that data security is becoming a priority. And that is kind of the tip of the spear when we talk about information readiness, right? Once you understand the value of your data, once you understand what is most important and drives the business, what you can curate for your AI applications, and you apply zero trust principles and least privilege, and you're monitoring behavior and access around that data, your posture automatically improves. Now, coming back to metrics, that posture is difficult to articulate to the board. But again, it's what were our cost savings in our data security, data hygiene projects? How many applications are encrypted now? Like, I think there's ways in which you can still tell that story to the board.
Absolutely. I mean, there shouldn't be an excuse that, oh, we don't have good measures. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the proxy measures are better than no measures.
Yeah.
In fact, when I use my CPD framework and assessment tool, there are measures. They are perceptual. Sometimes they are objective. Sometimes they are measured as yes and no. Sometimes they're measured on a scale of 1 to 5 or a 0 to 5. But what I make sure, I don't accept a number by itself. I want an explanation from the rater as to why you rated the way you rated, because you have to get to the bottom of it. And I'm a fan of very contextualized understanding of the level of preparedness. And the reason I say that is I don't want to give you scoring sheet with a scoring scheme and a standardized description of what it means to be a 5 or a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1. While that is helpful as a guide, but I also want to give you the flexibility of disagreeing with that rating and providing your own rating based on your understanding of what the current situation is. And I have found great value in that. Going back to our topic of being prepared and being proactive, another case that comes to mind is the Mayo Clinic Radiology AI Governance Initiative, which integrated bias detection checkpoints and data readiness assessments throughout the model lifecycle. Their systematic approach ensured, talking about metrics, diagnostic accuracy, reduced data drift, and maintaining compliance with medical device regulations. So I think it's fairly easy to identify the metrics and the measures if you are willing to go down the path of being proactive, of being deliberate, and of being thorough, and of being contextual. There are lots of frameworks out there, guidelines out there. Sometimes they are so detailed and complicated. I know of CISOs who are like, I get overwhelmed. So my reaction to that is, okay, simplify things and try to understand security from the standpoint of your organization. And sometimes that deep dive really helps in developing a much better feel for the security needs of the organization.
I think the buy-in that you get
Yeah.
is essential, right? You're using their numbers, right? What numbers are you comfortable with?
Yeah.
Right? We've done something similar in terms of financial risk exposure, right? So when we do some calculations, with our customers in terms of, well, what would you consider for your organization? What's the cost of a record? And if your data is breached, because I've got numbers, I've got industry numbers, I can give you an ROI, but let's work with your numbers, right? If mine says you're going to save $50 million and you think that's crazy, what would you think it would represent? And that's a fantastic way to get buy-in, right? And again, when you're looking for success, and because you need to launch these programs, right? And they need successes. And what you described is a great way to start.
Talking about buy-in, something I recommend, I tell organizations that create these so-called destroy your business scenarios. What that means is scenarios where you identify different types of threats and how they can adversely affect operations, shut down operations. Sometimes companies have to declare bankruptcy. So you have to literally write down these different disaster scenarios and then make an assessment as to where the organization stands in terms of proactively thwarting such risks or detecting and immediately remediating these threats. But unless you go down that path where you do a thorough assessment and have a good understanding of what these risks are and how they can impact the organization and involve the C-level in this exercise, you're not going to get the kind of buy-in you need. Because at the end of the day, C-level wants the organization to thrive, to succeed, to sustain their growth. So you have to be able to connect with those value propositions from a security robustness standpoint. So unless they see that connection with clarity, they will definitely be supportive, but that support will not be as passionate and as engaged as you would like.
I don't know if it was in the first conversation you and I had, or if it was something I read afterwards, but it's like you need to build this trust first culture, right, inside the business. And it has to, like you said, it has to originate with the C-level, with the board, and be able to translate that down, because there's a lack of confidence, really. I mean, there's leaders are optimistic about AI, but there's misalignment. Like going back to that Ponemon study, like less than about 53%, I think, of respondents said, well, IT isn't really aligned with the business in terms of our goals and strategies and all the complexities built. Like we've seen, or how many customers have you talked to that from a Gen AI perspective? Well, marketing had one project, and then finance had another, and legal had another, right? And then soon you've got 5 or 6 different models, and there's because it's just sort of they're sprouting up. And I think that when agentic comes online, those things can't happen. Like that's the tipping point. There is a real fundamental challenge to organizations that they don't even know. Going back to what we were saying about the inferences that AI can make, the connections it can make, the prompt injections, the different types of attack surface that's emerging because of agentic AI. Everybody needs to be taking it very seriously before agentic starts to take off.
Absolutely. I think the more technology we use, the more we have to be deliberate, the more we have to be mindful. And I'm a huge fan that I'm all for AI, but AI has to be supplemented by human intermediation, whether that is in the form of random audits or the form of providing some oversight or in the form of recording findings and acting on them. But there has to be a human involvement from time to time to just make sure the systems are working as they are supposed to. So we have to build very good systems. We have to ensure good data is flowing through them. But at the same time, we also have to have humans involved to the regular checks. In other words, we don't throw away the audits of that we have always done, but we make those audits real time and not periodic or reactive. I was an auditor in my first career, and the traditional audits are good, but you're essentially evaluating what happened. But I'd rather know now, both from an auditor's perspective as well as from the organization unit that is being audited, from their perspective, what the issues are and how can we fix it before it gets any worse. So that proactive, immediate, real-time attitude is absolutely critical.
At OpenText, I don't know if we didn't coin it, but we call it human in the loop, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So kind of that oversight. And depending on what jurisdiction you're in, so the equivalent of Equifax in Europe, in Germany actually, had a credit scoring algorithm that they implemented, I think it's 2023 or something like that. And through the GDPR, a citizen came to the credit authority and said, why was I rejected? And they couldn't explain. It was completely autonomous, right? There was no oversight. It was just AI making that decision. You do not meet the credit standards. And they had to pause it. They had to stop the whole application because within Article 22 of GDPR, it says processing things autonomously is a violation of privacy rights, right? So again, depending on the jurisdiction, but best practices, absolutely. Putting some guardrails, I think, are really critical in terms of agentic and AI, just to be able to keep an eye on how things are progressing and what decisions are actually being made, for sure.
Well, Greg, this has been phenomenal. I wish we could go on and on, but unfortunately, we have to draw this episode to a close. I'd like you to share any final words that you have or any key messages for the listeners.
Well, I think we go back to trust, right? So when we touched on it a couple times, I think that with trust comes high adoption. With trust, you build more credibility with your customers that you are using contextual, safe, secure data. But trust is really what information readiness is built on, right? It's high quality data. And again, with those two things, you start to look at how trust can be used for competitive advantage and ultimately trustworthiness in you as an organization, the applications, the services you deliver to customers. So I think information readiness is, what do they say about planting a tree? The best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago. The next best is today. Well, your information readiness journey starts today, everybody. So let's get started.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. AI without information readiness is risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Secure, simplify, and govern your information first. Only then can AI deliver responsible, trustworthy value. So AI is great, but AI needs governance, AI needs oversight, and that's where information readiness comes into play. I hope you found our discussion useful. I'll see you next time. But Greg, thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
The information contained in this podcast is for general guidance only. The discussants assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this podcast. The information contained in this podcast is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantee of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness. The opinions and recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the discussants and not of any organization.